Look at some of the issues of water management, water quantity and quality in Canada and in China. Now, this is counterintuitive, so no, it's this way. What am I doing? There we go. So as we see from this, but I didn't know I was going to have this marvelous prop behind me. As Coleridge mentioned in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we have a lot of water on this planet, but actually not very much of it is drinkable, and that of course is the whole point of our lecture, and the whole point of considering fresh water in the context of human development. If we look at water supply through these little graphics, if you can imagine all the water in the world is this can here. You can see, no surprise, most of it's salt water. The freshwater component, which is the bit down here, is comprised mostly of frozen water of one sort or another, or groundwater. And a little bit at the bottom, the little red bit, is what we would normally think about as freshwater, liquid freshwater. So if you take this freshwater bit, the 2.5%, and expand it out, you can see most of it's frozen, Antarctica, Greenland, and so on, glaciers. A lot of it's underground, and this bit here is what we have to readily access. That is our liquid freshwater, rivers and lakes. Now, given that amount of fresh water that we have, that has to provide, it's a living resource, if you will, for humans as well as non-human inhabitants of this planet. But humans, oh, I'm sorry, I should have a lapel mic because I do wander all over the place. I'll talk really loudly if I wander away from the mic. So we have, what this graphic is showing is that we have been diverting water, as we do with most resources on this planet, for our own use. And what it's basically saying is, since 1960, for example, we have doubled the amount of water that we're withdrawing from lakes and rivers. And it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much fresh water on the planet. Sorry. If we're taking it for ourselves, then obviously there's less for wildlife, for example. So you can see how since 1960 it's an exponential diversion of water for human use. Some other facts, and these lectures are culled from, these slides are culled from many different sources. This one looks at the condition of water that people have access to. In terms of water supply, and this will be no surprise to anyone, in terms of drinking water or suitable water supply, you can see that we have an unserved population, according to the World Health, of somewhere over 1 billion people, about 1/7 of humanity, have inadequate access to water. And you can see where most of those people are in Africa and Asia. If you look at sanitation, even more people have lack of proper sanitation, about 1/3 of the world's population. Again, most of them in Africa and Asia. And of course, the two are linked. So improper sanitation leads to poor water quality. So not only not having access to water, but more often than not, where there is water, the quality is poor because it's contaminated. It's contaminated by sewage effluent, such as that. And unfortunately, that's all too common. People will, use that as a toilet effectively. They'll wash clothes in it, bathe in it. Kids will play in it. So it's no surprise that waterborne disease is rampant in many parts of the world. If we look at water availability of that small slice that I showed you at the beginning, basically, if we were to, through improved technology, we might be able to increase our availability, our access to fresh water, maybe by 7%. There are some estimates I've seen in the literature that say maybe by the middle of the century, we might increase by 7%, so we can get a little more than we currently have. However, the demand for water, because of more people, industrial development, more agriculture to feed those people and so on, the estimates are anywhere up to 85% more will be required. Well, do the math. there's a large deficit here. Where are we going to get it? I don't have answers. I just ask questions. You can provide the answers if you want. Can we melt? You know, people have talked about melting icebergs, hauling icebergs. Some ideas are really quite bizarre. Hauling icebergs to the tropics to provide fresh water for people that don't have fresh water. Well, if you haul an iceberg to the tropics where the water is warm, it's going to melt and just, you know, dissolve into the ocean. So what's the point of that? Piping water. One issue that I'm quite concerned about, I still do some work through the Great Lakes, the International Joint Commission, and quite concerned about issues of water diversion. It's quite conceivable that with the prolonged drought in the U.S., and I think something like 60% of the U.S. is experiencing a prolonged drought, the demand for Great Lakes water, it's always there, it's always in the background, but it may become more prevalent in the future. And ideas of pipelines diverting water from Lake Superior down into the U.S. could be the pressure to do that could become relentless. So those are things to consider. We fret about the price of oil, and every day you'll see the price of a barrel of oil. How often do you see the price of a barrel of water or a liter of water on the news? Never, right? Never. Now, last time I looked, I can't drink a glass of oil. I can't bathe in it. I can't cook with it, except indirectly by generating heat. So I don't understand why we'd have such a low regard for fresh water. We don't pay any attention to it at all. So just a little bit of background. Then we'll look at Canada and see some of the issues that we're facing here. This is the most recent information I could find from Environment Canada from 2007, but it probably hasn't changed a whole lot. Most of the water that we use in this country is to generate electricity. And it's thermal generation, which is either nuclear or fossil fuel. So coal, not too much coal anymore, but natural gas or oil or nuclear. So that's the major user of fresh water, and then you can see the other components here. You can see domestic use is actually relatively small compared to the other sectors in society. Many, by the way, just to, in most countries, the global average for fresh water use in agriculture throughout the world is about 70%. Most of that is because of irrigation. We don't need to irrigate our crops nearly as much in this country because we have rainfall. In most parts of the country, we have rainfall throughout the summer, throughout the growing season. Irrigation here is not as significant as it is in other parts of the world. So this is actually quite small compared to other countries. Manufacturing has become quite efficient over the years, and actually through recirculation and treatment of wastewater. For example, the mining industry, as you can see, is quite efficient. It actually uses the water that it extracts from local rivers more than twice because it recirculates, it treats the water, and can use it again. So it's a relatively efficient industry. I just got this graphic today. Now you may question the source. It comes from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, but a fact is a fact. You may argue about should we be extracting oil from Alberta. This is the use of water to extract bitumen from sand. But the point of this graphic is even in the Alberta oil patch, the amount of water used to extract a unit of bitumen has been decreasing significantly. So back in 1975, it took almost 5 barrels of water to extract 1 barrel of bitumen. They're now down to about half. So in terms of water use, it's certainly decreased. I'm not saying anything about the water quality that results from that activity because that's a whole other story. But they're certainly trying to reduce the amount of water they're using and presumably reduce the amount of pollution by simply discharging less. Even the pulp and paper industry, which is a major player in this country, has decreased the amount of water that they've used. I've looked high and low, and I cannot find a graph that goes beyond 1997. Maybe I just haven't looked in the right places. But in any case, it shows quite a significant trend down. So the pulp and paper industry has become quite efficient in terms of their water use as well. They've decreased by, as you can see, by about 55% from the mid-70s, which is quite significant. So in terms of water conservation, I think industries are quite aware of the need to do that. Agriculture, I mentioned before, is an interesting industry, if you want to consider it as that, because think about if you do extract water, say you have a well, and you are irrigating your crops in the summer, some places in southern Ontario do, that water that's extracted from the ground is sprayed on the crops. Most of it evaporates, and eventually it condenses somewhere else. So it's actually a net loss of water from that geographic area, from its source. Where we really see high water withdrawals is in places where agriculture is being carried out in essentially a semi-desert area, which is this area here, in southeastern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan. Probably, and I showed this slide a couple of months back to an industrial group, and a couple of people were from out west, and they said, yeah, it's really dry out there and we probably shouldn't be farming there, but we do anyway. These are the dark colors here indicating high water stress. So these areas are using a lot of groundwater to irrigate their crops, and basically what it's saying is, well, maybe we shouldn't be growing crops in that area. So certainly there are places in the country, despite what I said about irrigation, there are some places that are very heavily irrigated and do use a lot of water. I mentioned thermal generation and use of water. You can see the sector withdrew, as I showed in that pie chart, 59% of total water consumed in the country. And you wonder why so much cooling? And until I started reading about this to prepare the lectures, I give some of these slides in one of my undergraduate courses. And it's kind of obvious if you think about it. Electricity generation is, at least thermal generation with heat, is quite inefficient. So about 40% of the energy in the fuel, if it's natural gas or oil, is converted to electricity, and the rest is waste heat. Oh, why is it doing that? Go away. How do I get rid of this thing? So the rest of it is waste heat. So you need to reduce that waste heat somehow before you discharge back into the environment. And that's where the whole cooling water process comes into play. So you've got wasted energy, 60% of the energy in that fuel is wasted, and you've got all this water that has to cool that waste heat. So it's a very, very inefficient process. Hydroelectricity, that is generated like Niagara Falls, for example, is certainly much more efficient, but of course it carries with it some major environmental issues, such as blocking rivers for upstream fish migration, creating large reservoirs where temperatures change, where you can get siltation, where you can get methyl mercury buildup and so forth. So there's no process that's perfect, not even wind energy, where I just read this week that the Ontario government, total aside, the Ontario government approved the destruction of a bald eagle nest on Lake Erie so they could put up a wind generator. I don't understand that.
Your number of 40% is only applicable for the new combined cycle, the newest generators. The old oil and coal are down around 15–20%.
Ah, thank you.
It's
okay.
even worse.
It's even worse? Thank you. I'll change that. Okay. So, yeah, and if you just look at an incandescent bulb and see how much heat's released, I mean, it's a very, really poor way of producing light and heat. So 15%. Okay, I'll make sure to note that. This graphic indicates basically how much water is used to generate different ways of generating electricity. Obviously with wind it's virtually nil. If you go down to nuclear, there's a lot of water used, but with coal even more. Of course with nuclear there's no carbon dioxide emission, or there shouldn't be anyway. It's got its other set of issues, of course, but with coal, you've got very high water use to cool the waste, to reduce the waste heat, and also you've got a high carbon footprint. So, it's not surprising that people want to phase coal out. As I mentioned, manufacturing accounts for about roughly 20% of the water that's used in the country. Pulp and paper is a major industry, as is the auto industry, and you can see these figures are quite amazing. I got these from US EPA. I would imagine, because our auto industries are fairly integrated, these numbers probably apply in Canada. So that's a lot of water to produce a car. I don't know whether the size of the car makes a whole lot of difference. So if you're driving a Cadillac, whatever the monster SUV is that they have, or something like my Nissan Altima, I don't know, but it's a lot of water. So to make the steel for the car, to make the rubber, the plastics, whatever is involved in that car, a lot of water to make a car. How do we use water ourselves on a more personal level? We're very big users of water in this country, probably because we have a lot of it, and as I said at the beginning, we don't seem to value it very much, and so it's perceived as essentially free, although it isn't. And so we use a lot. We use 330 liters roughly per person per day, and this is in the municipal sector. So that would account for firefighting, for example, or watering municipal parks, but it also, of course, a large component of that is personal water use. So here's some graphic from a 10-year slice from up to 2009, and you can see the residential water use, which is the light blue, hasn't changed a whole lot. It fluctuates around 330, 350 cubic meters per, what am I doing here? And if you will see later on, how does that compare? I said we use a lot of water. How does that compare with the rest of the world? Well, we'll have a look at that in a minute. What do we use most of our water for? Well, fortunately, we're fairly clean creatures in this country, so most of it's for, as you can see, for showering and bathing, and if we still have high flush toilets, then a lot of it's there. I presume that number is going to come down as we have more efficient toilets, and you can see the rest here. So those percentages are not likely to change. But if you look at the municipal sector, as I just mentioned, it's comprised of a number of components. There's a commercial sector. Every city's got industry in it. So we could look at how much we as individuals, what's the residential part? It's about half, roughly. This number here is quite disturbing, the leakage part. So we treat our water, we extract it from the Great Lakes, for example, here in Hamilton or Toronto or Oakville, where I live. We extract it, we treat it, we distribute it through a water distribution system to homes, and we lose 13% of it on average through just bad infrastructure, poor infrastructure, old infrastructure. If you see look at Montreal last week. They had rivers, literally rivers flowing down the streets, and buildings flooded. Some of the buildings in McGill were flooded. I've got a relative he's studying engineering, and I phoned him and he said, yeah, some of the buildings the basements are flooded, and so it's chaotic, catastrophic actually. Every week, in Toronto, some water main has burst or something, because part of it, I suppose, is our climate, the freeze-thaw cycle. You would think, with the pipes being buried below the frost line, that shouldn't be an issue. But I think a lot of our infrastructure is just old, and it's decaying, and we're not replacing it fast enough, and we're going to see more and more of that. So this precious resource is leaking out, and it's going to be at an ever-increasing rate, I think. I do work in Mexico, just a side issue, and in some places, in some cities in Mexico, that number is up to 40–50%. So, and they don't have the winter issue that we do, so you can't even use that as an excuse. So they're treating their water, whether you choose to drink it or not is another matter, but their pipe water into their house, they're losing about half of what they're treating, so it's just it's quite shocking, actually. So as you can see, we're losing another component, at the municipal level, you saw that 13%, but overall, we're losing about 12% of all the water that we're withdrawing just by leaking pipes and reservoirs. So if you think about the reservoirs, particularly out west in the prairies, where there's, they have river systems, so they've dammed up a number of systems to create reservoirs, like Diefenbaker Reservoir in Saskatchewan, for example. When you have water in a large surface such as that, it evaporates. So we're losing water overall. Besides the bad plumbing, we're also losing water through the reservoirs. And with climate change, with increasing temperature, I presume that rate is going to increase. So that's agriculture. I mentioned that, showed you that at the beginning. About 8% of the total, and I showed you Alberta being quite high. It's considered a consumptive use. There are a lot of words here, but basically if you just focus in on the last bit here, it's considered a very consumptive use. That is, you're actually consuming the water, and I mentioned why. You're taking it from the ground, using it, it's evaporating, and it's condensing, it's going through the hydrologic cycle, and it could be raining or snowing, thousands of kilometers away. So it's considered as a consumptive use. You can't sort of recycle that water because it's no longer in the geographic area from which it was extracted. Mining, I also, just to reiterate, it's relatively efficient now. It's a small part of the total water consumption in the country, but it's quite efficient in terms of reuse and recycling. So, what have we actually got? Those are some of the uses. Canada's quite well off in terms of water. If you look at these two graphs, the blue one looks at the total amount of water, renewable water, that we have access to in various countries. You can see the Russian Federation. I mean, it's a much bigger country geographically than Canada. But we are basically second in the world. The United States is third in terms of accessible surface fresh water. But if you look at how much we have per person, of course, I always hit the wrong button. We're way ahead of the others. Why? Well, we have a lot of water. We only have 35 million people. Again, do the math. So we have a lot of water per capita and a lot of access or potential access to that fresh water. So 86,000 cubic meters, I don't know how many swimming pools that is, but it's a lot. How do we stack up in the rest of the world? Well, for some reason, this is a graphic from the OECD, and for whatever reason, Canada was not in this list. I don't know why, but so I couldn't get the equivalent number for 2006. But so for 2000, this was our consumption here per capita for all uses, not just domestic. This is for all uses, and here's the USA over here. So two countries are far and away the highest consumers amongst the OECD countries by a long shot. So water conservation is not something that we really take too much, other than some of the selected industries I mentioned. Where are the real water stresses in this country? It's hard to think about that. Say, well, what do you mean water stress? I mean, we've got 5 lakes out here. What's the stress? These lakes have, I can't remember the numbers now. I tend not to keep these in my brain anymore, but we have several hundred cubic kilometers of fresh water in the 5 Great Lakes. So what's the stress? Well, there's only so much of it that you can actually access in any reasonable time frame in terms of treatment. I showed you the agricultural situation out here already, highly stressed, because you're basically farming, and this is a semi-desert area here. But southern Ontario is high population, a lot of agriculture, and a limited access, capability of extracting water. There are only so many river systems here, and there's only so many water treatment plants that can extract water from the Great Lakes and treat them and distribute them. So as the population keeps increasing here, we're now in the GTA, 6-7 million, I guess? And I believe the forecast is another 2 million within the next 15 years. So we'll be up to 8-9 million people, and we have to provide water for those people. And as I said, it's very expensive to build treatment plants and build pipes to run into the lakes to draw that water up. So that's why this area here that we live in shows as being under water stress. And it's hard hard to believe that when you turn your tap on in the morning and there's water flowing. And has there ever been a water stress? Maybe hot summers, very hot, dry summers, you get watering restrictions, and it's not because the lakes are drying up, it's because we can't treat enough water to provide for all the customers. And that's the issue that I just talked about. It's really provision of water for use. With climate change, we're going to face another issue. The projections are the water levels in the Great Lakes will decrease because of increased evaporation. Even though there's projected to be more precipitation, there'll be more evaporation. So the net effect is supposedly a decrease in water level. And what that would mean is if you have a water intake, say that we're in Oakville where I live, the water intake in the Kerr Street plant is about several hundred meters offshore, probably in about, I think they told me it's in about 15 to 20 meters of water, if I'm not mistaken. If the water levels decrease significantly, and the projections are, think for Lake Ontario by about between half and 1 meter, conceivably with storms, and the storms projections for more violent storms projections are there will be more violent storms. You could get bottom sediments stirred up because of wave action and so on, because the water level is lower, and that would mean more sediment entrained into the intake pipes, increased cost of treatment, and increased cost to the consumer. So there's another factor that comes into play here, and that's kind of the quality of the water as well as the quantity. Some trends here in terms of what we've been able to extract in southern Ontario. These are yields, so basically how much water we've been able to extract over the years. You can see there's been a steady downward trend since 1971. So basically we're kind of at reach capacity in terms of how many wells we've dug, how many treatment plants we've got, and building more plants will level that line off a little bit. Same story for the prairies, a downward trend over the same period of time. So, some questions. This is not imminent, it's not a disaster tomorrow, but these are things that we need to think about. We may find, especially in the summer, we may have water restrictions in place more frequently than we do now. And again, with climate change, we're likely to perhaps see more of this type of thing, of water shortages, particularly in areas where they rely on river water for treatment, for source water. That may be a factor. Switching gears, we'll look at some issues in China, which are, to me now, at least from what I can see, much more imminent and much more disastrous in many ways. I think, everyone's projects China to be, its constant sort of economic growth. What they've done in the last 30 years has been absolutely amazing. It has come at a cost, which you'll see, and I think the fact that they may be running out of water is going to impede their economic growth. Oops, I'm always hitting the wrong button. There we go. So just some basic statistics. Large population. Much of their grain, which is of course rice, but also wheat and corn and other crops, is on irrigated land. Some is rain-fed, but most of it's irrigated. But more and more of the water that's available is now being diverted to urban areas for industry. So if you do that, again, it's a zero-sum game. If you're taking water away from agriculture and putting it in cities, there's less agriculture, less food. You've got to feed 1.3 billion people. So what do? You can import it, or as China is actually doing now, they are leasing land in many countries around the world, and they're growing food crops in those countries and shipping them those crops right back to China. So how does it meet that need? It's got many sort of conflicting needs, urban, industrial, agricultural. And it's difficult to buy crops on the open market. There used to be surpluses of grain on the open market, but those surpluses are disappearing or have disappeared And basically whatever's left and available to trade on the open market, China could essentially buy it all up and would be nothing available for anyone else. So what's the limitation? I mean, China's a large country, and why can't they expand their agriculture? Well, if you look at this map, most of the Chinese population and the agriculture is sort of in this part of the country. This part is desert and mountain. Really very unsuitable and very dry, so not really suitable for agriculture. So you really have, maybe a third of the country that's suitable for agriculture, and that's where most of the people live. So you can see the rainfall patterns here. Very, very low rainfall in this part of the country, higher rainfall here, and this is where most of the agriculture and water resources are. So that's the conundrum, that most of the people live in sort of about a third of the country. The rest of it is not really suitable for growing crops. You can see the population growth has been quite staggering, almost doubled in 60-some years. And as I said, most of the population are in the two very large river basins, the north and the south. I know there's a lot of numbers here, but I just want you to focus on a couple of these things I've circled here. So this is water supply. This is 2006. Oops, 2006. And this is looking at some major regions in China and how much water they're actually using. And I've just circled a couple of them here as they're using almost, in this case, is there any way to shut this thing off so it doesn't do that? They're using almost 100% of what's available. In this case, about over 60%. In most cases, they're approaching 50% of what's available in the north. So these regions are highly stressed already, and they will become more stressed. So they're using surface and groundwater. You can see the groundwater, for example, here. 95% of their groundwater is already being used. So they're using virtually everything that they've got, and it's only, as I said, it's going to get worse. These are projected water uses into 2030. So what you just saw, you can look at domestic use is going to go up by 35%, industrial use 50%, and domestic and agriculture by another 13%. So where do you get all the water to satisfy these needs? They're already stressed. You just saw the previous graph. Where do they get all this water from? Some numbers here. I'm giving you a lot of numbers, and I tell my students, don't memorize the numbers, but just look at the pattern. I'm not going to test you on this, don't worry. So 300 of 662 cities in China have insufficient water, and 110 will have severe water shortage, and there are definitions of what that means. So within roughly 20 or 30 years, they could have a water deficit equal to about 80% of what they currently have. So that's a very significant challenge to try and meet that deficit. And I don't expect you to read all this stuff, but just to give you a list of some of the issues, and they're not surprising. The water resources, in many cases where they do have water resources, are in areas where there aren't a lot of people, and so they're looking at actually diverting water from those areas into the more populated zones. They have industrialized, no surprise, the industrialization, urbanization has gone on at a staggering rate. I can't remember how many cities over 1 million people are in China, but it's a very, very high number. Very bad management, very, very poor water management, poor enforcement of water pollution regulations, for example. The whole institutional system for management is fragmented, which is kind of interesting given the kind of government in China. You'd think it would be much more uniform, but it's not. And a very inefficient system of how they use water. There's no water rights at all, so nobody has a right to use water, and they can't trade that water right. Pricing is poor. Well, we shouldn't talk because our pricing here is very, very poor. And they have, as I said, very poor record in environmental protection and pollution control. I said they can import grain on the open market, but that's going to be at the expense of other countries. And basically China could buy all the grain in the world and essentially drive the prices up. And as I mentioned, there's really not a lot of excess grain around. So growing crops in other countries, I mentioned, certainly is a solution. I don't know how many countries China's in doing this sort of thing and how much land they can lease to do this, but I presume if there are people willing to lease their land, then they can certainly offset some of their food requirement, but probably not all of it by a long shot. Some of the issues they've faced, the Yellow River is the large river system in the north. Just imagine the St. Lawrence River drying up and not reaching the Atlantic. This is what we're talking about here, right? This is a huge river system. Why do they call it the Yellow River? A lot of sediment erosion. So during flood periods, the river literally looks yellow because of all the suspended sediment. And you can see it actually dried up in 1972. It failed to reach the ocean. And you can see here what's been happening. It's run dry every year, and the dry period has been getting longer and longer every year. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not sure. Let's skip over that one. Never mind. So we had, you can look at 226 days. It's more than half a year when the river is not even reaching the last province before the ocean. So that would be the equivalent of the St. Lawrence River drying up at Cornwall before it gets to Quebec. I mean, it's hard to imagine that. And that province, provides a lot of agricultural products for the country. So, and with the growth of population, of course, that's going to change significantly. The Yellow River discharge, and we had a delegation of people from China come in 2 years ago, and I showed them some of these same slides, and they said, "Oh, we fixed that," and they actually gave me some papers to look at. What they've done is they've modified the mouth of the Yellow River to try and change the erosion patterns and slow down the erosion patterns. But as far as I could see, they haven't done a whole lot about trying to slow down or reverse this decrease in flow to try to have water conservation and manage the flow. So this river is still, has some major challenges. So it's, they're looking to stabilize the mouth of the river, but as far as I could see, the actual flow still is a work in progress. I haven't seen anything to tell me they've been successful. How am I doing on time? The Yangtze River in the south has a lot of water. The watershed of the Yangtze River, there's no problem. It seems like they'll have enough water to last well into the next couple of decades. Just some quick facts. I've got to hurry up here. I'm going to run over time. The population of China, to look at the numbers I've been talking about in terms of changing populations, the urban population increasing. This only goes to 2002, and the rural population declining. So people are leaving the land for jobs in the city, but also there's no water. The groundwater is being diverted to industry. Industry can drill wells down 800 meters if they have to. A farmer can't do that. So the farmers have no water. So they're abandoning their land or switching to what they call rain-fed agriculture. In other words, if it rains, you get a crop. Well, if it doesn't rain, you don't get a crop. So it's no surprise that a lot of them are leaving and going into industry. We get a steady job. Their cultivated land has been decreasing as well for the same reasons. Water demand, the current demand in China now is about 483 billion tons. I'm not sure why they measure it in tons, but in any case. And you can see what will be required by 2030. It's kind of at the bottom here, but how do you satisfy that demand? The water availability per capita, which you saw the Canadian availability, it's one of the highest in the world. You look at China's per capita availability, and started off back in 1950 at around 5,000 cubic meters per person. Now it's down to about 1,800, so it's been declining. There's a UN scale, United Nations scale of water availability per person, and I think this probably brings them into the poor category. Some of the stressed areas you can see here, the darker ones are the more stressed river basins. The Yangtze is relatively unstressed. Up in the industrial sort of northeast here, it's really quite bad. Some of the economies, why industry is doing what they're doing. These numbers are from the late 90s, but it kind of illustrates the point. A ton of wheat in 1998 would bring you about $200 and consume 1,000 tons of water. 1,000 tons of water would produce roughly $14,000 worth of industrial activity or industrial output. So is it any surprise that water is being diverted from agriculture to industry? The changing water uses in China, you can see here. Domestic use and industrial use are increasing. Agricultural use is going down. It's just another way of showing, illustrating the point I made a couple of minutes ago. So farmers are losing. I said the groundwater is being depleted. Industry is depleting that groundwater. They can pump it out far more efficiently than the farmers can. And they're depleting the groundwater faster than they can recharge. And so they're drawing the groundwater below what's called the sustainable yield threshold. So rainfall can't replenish the groundwater fast enough, and so the water table is falling, and they're getting subsidence. So the surface of land in North China, so that area I just showed you, that dark gray area I just showed you on the map, the water table is falling by about 1.5 meters a year, and the land is physically subsiding. So anyone who's been to Mexico City knows what land subsidence is. If you've been to Mexico City and you've looked at any of the cathedrals in the Zocalo in the central square in Mexico City, you have to walk down to get into the cathedrals. They used to be at street level. Those cathedrals, those buildings have all subsided because all the groundwater has been extracted over the last 60, 70 years or more. So this is happening in China as well. So switching to dry land or what rain-fed farming is a solution, sure, but your yield is lower. And at some point, a farmer's going to say, I can't make a living at this. The job in the city is much more attractive, and they head off to the city. This is a map just showing some of the cities where there's land subsidence. So it's not sort of restricted to one area. It's quite pervasive. And pollution, now we've talked, this is all water quantity. So this is now water quality. And according to the FAO, you can see the numbers here, about 50,000 kilometers of rivers in China are so polluted that they can't support any kind of fish populations at all. And of course, you think about the quality of that water and the impacts on human health, for example, quite apart from any ecosystem impacts. It's quite significant. Oops. So the Yellow River, if you talk about no fish, they can't even use it for irrigation. It's so polluted. And of course, human consumption, people will still use it. And as I just said, there are some major health problems with it. Some of the issues you see here, different cancers, are very, very elevated because of the quality, we believe, because of the quality of water. So how do they fix it? I'm almost at the end. How do we fix it? On the demand side, as I said, importing grain may not be a solution. Might totally exhaust any grain excess in the world. And it's got to figure out some way of dealing with its own water scarcity issue. Growing crops in other countries is potentially a solution I just mentioned. Making industry and urbanization more water efficient, which of course is a message that any of us can use. Better water management at all levels, federal, provincial, and municipal. Improving their institutions so that they can manage things better, because doing this means improving their institutions. And of course, conservation is critical. Water efficiency in homes and industry. China's quite inefficient in its industry. In China, a ton of steel uses anywhere from 23 to 56 cubic meters. In these countries, Japan, Germany, and USA, less than 6. So it's very inefficient in its water use in industry. So restructuring the economy, relying on maybe different crops. But having said that, what is the major grain crop in China? Rice. How does rice grow? In water initially, right? So when you say this, it's fine, but that means changing a culture that's 5,000 years old. How do you tell people that, the main part of their food is rice? Well, stop eating rice and eat something that's more water efficient. I mean, it's very nice to say these things, but I honestly don't know how you will achieve it. There may be other crops that you can certainly attack in terms of efficiency. You can certainly have livestock and improvements in the way livestock are raised and energy production and so on. And also, of course, will mean reducing pollution significantly. In a communist society, I don't know, how developing a water rights system will play out, or if it can play out, but certainly pricing water at a reasonable rate to take into account conservation and pollution control and so on is really quite critical. One of the solutions they've talked about, it may be a bit hard to see on this, is actually diverting water from the Yangtze system up into the north, because there is a lot of water available in the Yangtze system, and diverting it up into the north. The supply side, diversion, I just said, water pricing is one way to set a price that might encourage conservation. So to kind of conclude, may not appear as though the two countries have similar problems, and maybe it's just a question of scale. Certainly China's got a big population and inefficient industry, and its agriculture is suffering. And it needs to address that very quickly, because it will impact on their economic development. In our case, we have some areas in the country, southern Saskatchewan and Alberta, and southern Ontario, where we've got either because of agriculture or high population, we've got areas that are going to be under significant water stress, and we need to figure out what to do, or we're going to be facing a major challenge as climate change impacts on that. Okay, thank you.